We are streaming. Hello, welcome back. This is our 7th session, I believe, on the Persian Bayan, the study of the Persian Bayan. And give me 1 second to share my screen. Actually, I need to. Notes. There we go. Oh, wait. Yeah, we're streaming. Okay. This and then. Okay. All right. Does everyone see the notes? Yes.
Yes. Well.
All right. Now, are we here? Vahi, we're continuation of Vahi 4, correct? But I don't remember where we stopped, Peter.
Let's see if there's somebody out there who remembers besides me.
You said you were going to go over Bob 8, and then I think we're starting Bob 10 through 19.
No, we're going to start with where we left off on 4. You see, the opening Bobs, or the opening Vahids of the Persian Bayan are much longer than what comes later on. Not always. I mean, actually, the first is very short, but some of them are quite long, and then they get shorter. And then, and don't ask me why. We don't know. The Bob didn't say why. So any sort of speculation that we would come up with is just that. It's a speculation. So my guess is that we're sort of halfway in between. Am I right? This looks Vahid 4, Bob 8 sounds about right. So, but before we jump into looking at these notes, I again want to ask if there's anybody who had something that they wanted to bring up, anything that jumped out at them during the reading this week, or if they want to just wait until that particular verse occurs, or in the appropriate Bob, and then bring it up then. But if anybody has something that they'd like to start with, I'm happy to address it before we get going. I do want to mention that I had an email from Alex who was asking about pronunciation and the different forms of the word Vahid, which is also Wahid, which is also Wahid, which is also Vahid. So you see, and there are 3 different words, and they mean substantially the same thing. One's masculine, another one's feminine, another one's I can't really quite figure out. Maybe that's their baby. But in any case, this is quite common in Arabic. Because all words are derived from triliteral roots. That means you have 3 letters, 3 consonants, and from that consonant come this family of words. And the family of words, the Arabic grammarians would like you to believe that they're perfectly consistent, and the architecture is beautifully designed from, of course, from God. Right, but the reality is that there are many inconsistencies, there are many irregularities. And to add to it, the Bab, of course, was going to re-reveal in Arabic. So his Arabic is quite creative at times. For example, the preface to the 7 proofs is composed entirely of derivatives of one word.
Wow.
It just goes on and on and on. And because there are no vowels, we don't even know what some of those words are. um, and also the Bab was revealing in Persian and Arabic. Sometimes the Arabic is almost completely pure, no Persian word, and some of the Persian is mostly Persian. In Baha'u'llah's case, he did the same thing. But there's a great deal of literature that's written with a combination of the two languages, which was not all that uncommon. What was uncommon was when you had somebody who was breaking the conventional rules right and left, and the Bab did that a lot. Apparently, that sort of radical messing with people's minds was not as necessary in the case of Baha'u'llah. The Bab had already done it for him, I suspect. And so consequently, Baha'u'llah's writings are less revolutionary, but also he writes in many more varieties. He writes in poetry. He writes in verses that are very similar to Sufi in style. And then he writes in legal style, and he writes in proclamatory, prophetic style. And, you know, Baha'u'llah's range of writing styles, according to himself, there are 9 different modes of revealed verses in the Baha'i revelation, whereas the Bab said there are 5 in the Babi revelation. And of course, as far as Muslims are concerned, in the Islamic dispensation, there's one kind of revelation. And those are the ayats, the verses of the Quran. So this dovetails very nicely to the theme of the 8th Bab of the 4th Vahid, where he's talking about the creative power of the verses of God, that the verses of God bring into existence all things, nourish them, and bring about their transformation, or what we would call death. Very interesting. If you do any comparative study of religion, you'll find that in Hinduism, there's this concept that God is the creator, God is the sustainer, and God is the destroyer. Brahman, Vishnu, and Shiva. So there are all kinds of commonalities that we're going to find into the future that link us with other religions, and therefore connect us with the belief systems of people, very diverse people around the world. Cool. Then he talks about how the core manifestation of the signs of God and the names of God comes in the number 19. And because the 19 is the form of unity or of oneness, because Vahid comes to 19. Again, a symbol for the unity of all things that come from the one creator. And so all the other names and attributes of God come from this fundamental 19. I love this expression that a glass of water of a follower of the Bab is worth more than anything that the unbelievers can do in this world, because then it brings it right back again to the importance of recognizing the manifestation and of following his laws, that this is really the central act of human existence. And no wonder then that this is how the Kitab-i-Aqdas begins, the very beginning verses of Kitab-i-Aqdas, recognition of manifestation and obedience to his teachings. And then this is, there are many permutations of progressive revelation that are explained by the Bab. In this case, it is better to comprehend the rank and the standing and the nature of the new manifestation than to know about all the previous manifestations, because the one that is the new manifestation is the one for today, and the previous ones are for previous days. And you know that famous passage where Baha'u'llah says, be concerned about the day in which ye live. This insistence that we must live in the present. And then, of course, in the case of Baha'u'llah, the present is a dispensation of at least 1,000 years and a cycle of at least 500,000 years. So the idea of what the present is really radically changed in the Babi Baha'i revelation, because it's not, you know, the previous messengers were talking about the coming of the day of God, when humanity would reach its special stage of development. Well, that day of God has come. There's no waiting around anymore. We're here, we're there. And this will be also very interesting for us to talk with the followers of other religions who also have a strong sense of the present moment being what's really the most important, not thinking about the past or the future, but living fully in the present. So let's move on to 9.
Peter, could I ask a question? I'm going to have to go at 8 o'clock, so I would love to ask this now if I can about Bob 8. The Bob mentions the letters of the living of the Quran.
Yeah.
That surprised me very much. I didn't know. Does Islam have letters? This concept of letters of the living? And while we're on the subject, what does that phrase really mean? Is it letters of the living?
Huruf-i-hai means literally letters of the living. It's a Persian form of an Arabic construction, would be huruf al-hay, which means the letters of life. But in this case, it means the letters of God, because he's the living. All life comes from God. So what are these letters? He explains in a number of the abwab of the Persian Bayan. The letters are the constituents of the word. When the manifestation selects particular people to be his followers and to carry on his teachings after him, he is selecting people who are going to be upholding the word that has been revealed. Without those letters to uphold the word has no way of permeating, of disseminating out to humanity. And therefore he explains that first you have this core group of believers that are selected to carry on this task. And then you have all the other believers that are generated by the huruf-i-hai. So the concept being the core are basically the core teachers of the faith of God. And then all others will be derived from them. They are the spiritual children, if you will, to use Baha'i parlance, the spiritual children of these original believers. Now, the parallel is very clear in many of the previous religions. In the case of Christianity, you have the 12 disciples of Jesus. Clearly, the 12 disciples of Jesus were the first people to teach the teachings of Jesus, to carry them out to other people. And that doesn't mean they were the only ones, but they were the beginners. They began, and that's why he chose one of the first people that he selected to be one of his followers was Peter, the fisherman. And he says, upon you will build my church, of course, because he's talking about the church, the body of Christ, as it's called in the Christian community, which means all the believers together. All believers since the time of the disciples have been generated by the 12 disciples. They've all come into existence through generations and generations of converts, if you will, from those original beginning. In Islam, you have the Imams, the 12 Imams. So the Bab makes this clear in a number of his passages in the Persian Bayan that the huruf-i-hai, the letters of the living, have existed in every dispensation. And in fact, if we look in our own dispensation, we find plenty of them. In fact, Baha'u'llah has multiplied the number of the letters of the living in this revelation, because not only do we have the disciples of Baha'u'llah help me out here. What is that word that we use for the people who pioneer to a country? They're the first people in that country. They have a special distinction. What? Knights. The Knights of Baha'u'llah. Yes, the Knights of Baha'u'llah. And then, of course, the hands of the cause. these are all people that are selected by the manifestation, by Abdul Bahar, by Shoghi Effendi, to bring the faith out to the entire world. And there are the spiritual parents. And of course, there are many other spiritual parents. And I'm sure that we'll discover many more of them in the future when we know our history better. And the point being that our spiritual parents are very, very important, because without these spiritual parents, we wouldn't know of the faith. You don't learn about a living faith of God by reading a book, because how would you know of the book's existence if it wasn't for the followers? How would you get a copy of the book? It's not like Barnes and Noble is going to carry the Kitab-i Aqdas anytime soon. You know, you have to get your Baha'i books from a Baha'i. And this is a wisdom of the manifestation who understands how things go. And he has to begin with the beginners, and then everything is generated from them. So that's the concept of letters of the living pertains to these first seminal believers who then carry the faith and generate the faith amongst all future generations. Okay. Any other questions that someone wants to ask about? I wanted to just bring up here is one of the passages in 4:9 where the Bab is talking about kings. And I think it's probably somewhat of a shock to Baha'is to discover that the Bab actually envisioned a future in which there were still kings, and that the kings were permitted to go and conquer other countries and persuade people to become Babis. He doesn't give them permission to kill people who don't become Babis, but he is given the Babi king is given the authority and the motivation to go and encourage people to become Babis. And actually, there are some interesting passages, one of which we already read, and one in this Vahid, where he talks about, if you want to persuade people to believe in religion, that it's hard to convince more than a small number on the merits of religion alone. But if it's in their self-interest to become a follower, many more will follow. And so, of course, a king is in a position where he is able to provide all kinds of enticements for people to convert to a particular religion. But again, it's very important for us to understand that everything that the Bab revealed in Persian Bayan was intended to be reviewed and either renewed by his successor or canceled. And everything that pertains to any sort of more than persuasion, let's say strongly encouraging people to become followers, anything that looks like violence, it's never really permitted by the Bab. The Bab never says that kings are allowed to go and kill people, but he says they're allowed to conquer. And clearly Baha'u'llah says they aren't allowed to conquer. This is no longer permitted. But also, since we've been living under some sort of a semblance of a democracy now since 1957, Baha'is tend to think that the perfect form of government that Baha'u'llah approved of, and that God surely must approve of too, is our form of government, right? So, of course, there's a Senate and there's a House of Representatives, and right? Well, not necessarily so. If you read The Promised Day Has Come, the Guardian quotes many passages from Baha'u'llah that say in the future there will be kings, and the kings will have executive authority, but they will not be tyrants. We tend to think that all kings are tyrants. And all I could say is, I love Queen Elizabeth. And if she was the head of my state, I would be very happy. And much happier than if it was most of the chaps who get elected to office. And of course, they're bad kings too, and they're kings. And the Bab and Baha'u'llah talk about that as kings who do not follow the law of God, who do not have the best interests of their people in mind at all times. But I just wanted to bring that out so that when you see the Bab talking about the king who becomes a Babi will be assisted by the power of God, and he will conquer all of the nations, and he will not take anything from the believers, the value of a grain of mustard seed. It sounds like this is a pretty triumphalist plan here. We're going to take over, you know? No, that was for whatever reasons at the time, this is the message that the Muslims of his time needed to hear in order to be reassured that the propagation of the faith of God will be successful, and it will be done from the top down. That's what they're used to. That's what they're accustomed to. And then Baha'u'llah comes and he says, it's not going to be top down anymore, my friends. It's all bottom up. It's all, you go and you spread the faith through your dedication to the cause of God, and through the inspiration that you channel to souls. And this is how people will be attracted to the faith. And eventually the world will become a Baha'i world, but it's not through any force. It's not through any imposition of beliefs. And of course, that's the most radical thing that you can possibly imagine. You know, there's no religion has ever been understood that way before. Christianity was not understood that way. It was understood still that it's going to be imposed by God. God's going to, you know, whip things into shape. He's going to come back in his return, and the day of his return, there are no excuses. You either do what I say or you're done. You're done eternally. And the same interpretation of Islam. And I don't see that it's possible for Baha'is to ever interpret Baha'u'llah that way, because Baha'u'llah has made it so focused on the individual's personal experience of God. This is the only true faith, is when we approach faith through our own independent investigation and our own conscience and heart accepts it. Otherwise, it's fake, it's not real, and it's no grounds for creating a united world. Let's go to 10. A summary of that, a summary of the summary is that in the time of each new manifestation, the sciences that have existed, which is the forms of human knowledge, are not just renewed, but they're radically reconstructed. And if we study the history of religion, we find that is in fact borne out. That in every case, in every dispensation, all of the sciences are reconceived. And in fact, Abdu'l-Baha makes the point in The Secret of Divine Civilization that it was through the influence of Islam and the sciences that came into existence and were renewed and expanded in Islam that Europe developed the modern concept of science and civilization. That did not come out of Christianity. That came out of Islam. And of course, this is really big news for Christians, because Christians tend to think that everything that's good came out of Christianity. But then also we must realize that if the huge expansion of knowledge and technology and civilization that we have seen in the last 2-3 centuries occurred under the influence of Islam, imagine what it's going to look like under the influence of Baha'u'llah. This is something we're already seeing the signs of this, because it's starting to filter in, you know, even without there being an objective consciousness of where it's coming from. So I think we're familiar enough with this idea that we don't need to dwell on it. The Bab was also quite insistent that he didn't want the Babis to be preoccupied with writing books about old ideas. Don't bother with the old ideas. They're brand new ideas that are going to come into existence. And those will be influenced by, inspired by the new revelation of God. Then I'm looking at 56. You know, there are a number of references where the Bab talks about who interprets the Bayan. So here is one reference where he says it's clear enough, it doesn't need any explanations or commentaries. Elsewhere, he says, the only one who can interpret it is me. Elsewhere, he says, the only one who can interpret the meaning after me is him whom God shall make manifest. And he even says, and his followers, those who have immersed themselves in his teachings so that they're able to see through his eyes rather than through the eyes of tradition. These are all very important points because the way that religion has been so messed up in the past is chiefly because of human beings believing that they had the right and the inspiration and the authority from God to interpret scripture for themselves. And not only for themselves, but then go out and tell other people what it means. And we all know that this is such a strong characteristic of human nature. This desire to have power and it may come out of a place that's very magnanimous. Maybe we do it out of love. Maybe it's not because we're trying to control people, but we really do it out of love. But whether we do it out of love or control or any other motive, if we're getting in between the book and the believer, it's a mistake, because that person needs to find out for themselves. And all we can do is accompany. We can accompany, we can share our insights. And then now he returns this, you know, remember we've had a couple of other statements where the Bab says that he can reveal the equivalent, he could reveal a certain number of verses in a certain number of hours, okay, or days. And here is another statement where he says the same thing. He says he could write the equivalent of the Quran in 2 days and 2 nights. All right. So that's 48 hours, right? 48 hours, about 4,600, 4,800 verses. What's the point? Why does the Bab keep reiterating this theme? What I want to suggest to you is that what he's saying is this is divine revelation is a power from God. I don't do this. This does not, I'm not a smart guy who sits down and writes a lot of things. These are verses that are revealed through me. I hear them and I speak them, or I write them. And this is their power because they don't come from the individual manifestation. They're coming through the manifestation. So for example, in the Bible, when we read, and the Lord said, yeah, there you go. And you have in the Quran, it says, kul, which means say. I mean, he's telling Muhammad, speak these words, right? And Baha'u'llah does the same thing, but he says in his writings, he said, anything that I reveal, whether I do it in the voice of God or not, is coming from the same place. It's coming through me. And he puts a period on this by saying the verses of God cannot be compared with the verses of men, because human beings write based upon our own consciousness and our own understanding, and the manifestation doesn't. It's not his understanding. It's revealed through him. So now we're going to go to 11. I think we've, all of these teachings that were in 11 were already covered. This happens sometimes in the Persian Bayan, that it's almost like the Bab wants to give you a summary. He says, remember, this is what we've already covered. And in this particular Bab, he makes a reference to Baha'u'llah in connection with him whom God shall make manifest. Important for us to realize that the Bab did not come right out and write a tablet or write a verse in any of his books saying, Baha'u'llah, you know that guy, Mirza Ali Hussein, he's the promised one. He didn't do that. And we might ask, well, why not? You know, if he was American, he would do that. He'd just say it, you know, this is the guy. Friends, consider this. After the Bab died, 25 people claimed to be him whom God shall make manifest. And Mirza Yahya tried to kill a number of them because he didn't want to, at that point, proclaim himself him whom God shall make manifest, but he certainly didn't want any competition. So, and the other thing is, before Baha'u'llah actually openly revealed his station, Mirza Yahya tried to kill him. He tried to poison him. I mean, I shouldn't say tried to, he did poison him, actually, and the effects stayed with him for the rest of his life. So imagine if Baha'u'llah had been appointed specifically, clearly, without any question, to be him whom God shall make manifest. Do you think he would have survived into the 1860s? I don't think so, friends. I think he would have been taken out either by a fellow Babi, or taken out by a Muslim, or taken out by a government. Because the Babis were all vying for leadership. Many of them were. And the various governments there, the Ottoman government and the Persian government, were trying to stamp out the Baha'is. Stamp out the Babis, I mean, because they saw them as being a threat. So he did us an enormous favor by not fingering Baha'u'llah, but he makes allusion to him all over the place. And I tried to point out any time that the Bab is alluding to Baha'u'llah as being him whom God shall make manifest. And if you've got your eyes open, you see it all the time. But for the Babi, who is not sure of himself, there are clearly many of them were not convinced by reading the Persian Bayan. Or maybe they didn't read the Persian Bayan. You know, this is one of the big problems with scripture, is that the manifestation of God reveals it, and then how many people read it? You know, we shouldn't assume that everybody's read the entire Persian Bayan before Baha'u'llah declares himself. And in fact, scholars have written quite a bit on this subject, that there were Babis had a lot of really wacky ideas, individual Babis, about reality that does not conform to what the Bab revealed about reality and what Baha'u'llah revealed. But that also has its reason. You know, there's the passage from the Quran where it says, if God had meant for all people to have the same faith, then he would have made it so. But it is up to us. It is our choice. And this choice is our destiny. This is our human nature, is to make choices and not to have it forced upon us. And of course, because he's talking about him whom God shall make manifest, he's also saying that He's alluding to the fact that he has predicted the coming of his successor, even as Jesus predicted the coming of Muhammad, with a similar outcome, is that he's not going to pull the veil fully away from the reality and make it obvious, and Jesus didn't either. And the Quran says this passage where it says that the successor to Jesus would be named Ahmed. And there's elaborate theological reasoning about this by Muslims, trying to understand, well, if there is, then how come we've never read it? How come it's not in the Gospels? And this was one of the sources for them saying that the Gospels have been corrupted. They can't be accurate. They can't be the accurate word of God, because then if it was, then this verse that predicts the coming of Ahmad would be there for everybody to read. And Baha'u'llah explains this very beautifully in Kitabi Agan and in some other writings. So I won't reiterate that. But one of the things I wanted to point out is that you may know this, that according to sources that most of us know about, but we don't know what they are. The Kitabi Agan is the continuation of the Persian Bayan. So I haven't yet talked about the organizers yet, but I'm hoping that what we can do is, after we finish studying the Persian Bayan, we go and read the Kitabi Agan with new eyes, because we'll be looking at it after having read the beginning of the Kitabi Agan, right? And then we'll be seeing its fulfillment in the writings of him whom God shall make manifest. Let's go to 12. All right, this is progressive revelation. We know about that. We know about God abrogates the old laws in the new dispensation. We know also that in every dispensation, the word of God decrees certain places as holy and abrogates other holy places of previous dispensations. And in this Bab, now you can imagine, this is 1848, the Bab is in prison. And he reveals a law saying that pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina is forbidden. You know, I lived in Israel for a number of years, and we have an expression in Hebrew. It's called Eze Chutzpah, and it means, look at this guy. He's got so much gall, you know, and he's fearless. You can't imagine anybody before the Bab in the 1400 years that preceded, or at this point, 1264 years since the coming of Islam. You cannot imagine a single Muslim saying that you are no longer allowed to go on pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. That would be grounds to be executed on the spot. This is one of the most holy laws of Islam. And yet the Bab says straight away, no, this is the province of the manifestation. The manifestation can decree any place sacred, and he can abrogate the pilgrimage to any other place. So we'll go on to the next. That's more of the same. And then 14 will be about, it starts being about the shrines of the faith of the Bab, which of course is what we would expect. It's going to be the place of the birth and death of the Bab. It's going to be the place of the birth and the death of the letters of the living of the Bab, right? Because they are the letters from which all other Babis will come. And then he says that if you come to one of these places, that you may be granted asylum there. You may be protected from prosecution. And And of course, again, it's praiseworthy to make pilgrimage to these places and to pray in those places. But of course, as with all his other laws, he always ends up by saying it has no value if you don't recognize him whom God shall make manifest. And yes, we don't need to overgo this, except that, of course, if somebody is looking for iterations of the golden rule and they want to find one by the Bab, it's found in Vahid 4, Bab 14. It's right there. And so I would recommend you make a note of that, because very often what people do is they leave out the Bab. They have something from the Bible, from Old Testament, New Testament, from the Quran, from the maybe Buddhists and the Hindus and so forth in the Baha'i writings, and they usually leave out the Bab. So here's you can do this. You can find it. Okay.
Which Vahid is that?
That's in Vahid 4.
Okay, 4.
Bab 14. So in 15, again, he's talking about asylum. And the people may take asylum in the Babi shrines. And then he talks about the purpose of having holy places. This is a very interesting point, because it's there's not a whole lot written in any of the revelations about the purpose of pilgrimage and the purpose of having holy places to which we can go, and the influence that this can have on our lives. So you might want to make a note of this too, so that if somebody asks you at some point in a fireside or over lunch or something, why do you have those shrines? What's the big deal with all those buildings that you have in Haifa and Akka? What's the point of that? Do you really need buildings? Because there are a lot of people who are very skeptical about that. They say, well, why don't you take that money and go out and help poor people, or address climate change, something practical, okay? And you can hear they're sort of like, God, you guys are pretty smart, but I don't get why you do this, And so this would be a really good text to really study and think about, and look for parallels in the Baha'i writings. And to summarize this, is human beings need to have a location. The location is really important. And the location for the believer and the time of the manifestation is the manifestation himself. He is the house of God. He is the most holy place on the planet. When he passes, then there have to be other holy places that people can go, that where they can meditate and pray and feel that they are in connection with the manifestation. So that's what this Bab is about. Let's go on to the next one. Here's a great example of how the Bab does things. He says how important it is to go on pilgrimage, and all the conditions that need to be followed when you're going on pilgrimage, what you need to do, the way you need to behave, okay? And then he says, but you don't have to go. If you are far away and getting to the place of pilgrimage is going to be onerous for you, dangerous for you, it may adversely affect your health, it's beyond your budget. In other words, the vast majority of humanity don't have to go on pilgrimage. It's not required. And this, to me, this is a great sign of the Bab's love. And he also makes the point elsewhere. He says that when you serve other people, with love in your heart and with the same intention that you would have on going on pilgrimage. It's as if you went on pilgrimage. And as we know, Baha'u'llah reiterated this teaching in the Kitab Yaqdas. Then, interesting, in the end of this Bab, the Bab calls for the establishment of a universal mail and news service to be established by the Babis, similar to what already existed in Europe. I don't know what you hear, but I'm hearing the Guardian's statement in the World Order of Baha'u'llah, where he's talking about the future world government, and he says there will be a means of communication that links all people with each other. And we are enormously blessed to live in a time when we are so close to that happening. It's not universal by any means. There are still billions of people who are not on the internet, who we can't communicate with using this technology. But more than ever before, humanity is in touch with each other. And this is something that the Bab talked about, and he wanted Babis to be involved. So rest assured that there is a reason why there are so many Baha'is who are involved in IT. And it's not just because it makes good money and it's flexible so you can go pioneering. It's also because we know somehow in the depths of us, this is part of creating the world order, is being able to communicate with each other, to be in touch with each other. But again, so important for the Bab. What is the purpose of having this rapid mail service, this communication? So that all of us may hear of the coming of him whom God shall make manifest and recognize him. Again, he's never going to let up, friends. He always comes back to that refrain. If you don't recognize Baha'u'llah, you're out of luck. I think this is one of the reasons why it's so important for Baha'is to read the Persian Bayan, is to understand the context, to understand that the Baha'u'llah did not just have a herald. He had a #1 promoter. He had an agent, who was pushing him at all times, and he continues to. Spiritually, he's doing it from the other world, undoubtedly. This is why the Master says that the House of Justice and the Guardian are under the protection and guidance of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Not just Baha'u'llah, it's both of them. Again, 17 is going to talk about the possessor of all things is God, and that God has a greater right to all property than anyone else because he created it. Interesting that he actually dug down into the details here and said it's important that buildings that are built for the worship of God need to be independent of the normal legal system that regulates the ownership of property. And that is the whole concept that a sort of nonprofit status, but it's nonprofit status taken to a very high level. And this is interesting here. It's not permitted to sell lands that are adjacent to the shrine, to the house of God. And and there's a right for eminent domain, so that if there lands that are close to the shrine, that those become the property of the faith, so that they can protect the holiness of that place of worship. Now we go 18. It speaks about circumambulation. This is a theme that would have been instantly recognizable to any Muslim Babi, because circumambulation is such an important part of their pilgrimage. And not just their pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, but also their pilgrimage to the Atabat, to the tombs of the 12 Imams. Again, this reiteration of you're only permitted to go on pilgrimage if it does not cause you hardship. Then he reiterates that the writings of him whom God shall make manifest are the most important proof of the truth of his mission. And then it talks about taxes. Well, good. Yeah, it talks about taxes, and it again reiterates that pilgrimage is only required once in a lifetime. Women are not required to make pilgrimage, and we must also understand that this does not mean that women are not allowed to make pilgrimage. It's just they're not required. And not required, this is actually explained. I'm not sure that it's explained in the Persian Bayan, but Baha'u'llah does explain it in the Kitab-i Aqdas. And he says it's basically to relieve women of the responsibility to do something if it's onerous. It's a matter of hardship. If a woman is taking care of her children or her grandchildren, or she's going through menopause or whatever, if it's going to be a pain for her to go on pilgrimage, she doesn't have to go. But we must always remember that because you're not required doesn't mean that you're not permitted. And it doesn't mean that it's not a holy act. It's a holy act for anybody who does it. I love this one where he says, you're not allowed to buy a pilgrimage for a dead person. When they're dead, okay? You know, they missed their opportunity, or maybe they weren't even a believer, but you think, well, you know, if I could purchase their pilgrimage, then, you know, then they'll be, you know, God will be happier with them because they actually made pilgrimage because I paid for it. No, he's not going to allow that sort of nonsense. And this is, there are no cases where he allows you to pay for something that you didn't get by honest means. This was, as you may recall, this was the reason why Martin Luther broke with the Roman Catholic Church, is because Roman Catholics could basically pay and get out of any obligation or be forgiven any transgression. And Martin Luther said there's no basis for that in the Gospels. And of course, he's right. There is none in the Gospels. And the Bab is very emphatic. You're not going to pay to get there. Which is terrific because it's another way of saying that the credentials of the true believer are not in their bank account. Elsewhere, he says they're not in their intellect or in their degrees either. But especially is this important about bank accounts, because people with big bank accounts have been presuming that they can have access to everything. And he's making it very clear that that's not the case. Let's go quickly through this. Let's go on to 19. Let's see. Oh, yes, this is a lovely thing. So he's making a specific provision for women who live in Shiraz or in the province of Fars to make pilgrimage to that particular place and to sit in chairs. 19 women sitting in chairs during the night chanting prayers. I don't know about you, but I could just envision this, of the power, this is a women's liberation circle, I could totally see this group of sitting around saying prayers together and raising their arms and connecting with the spirit in this place. And Baha'u'llah doesn't say that you can't do this. So maybe someday, women will make pilgrimage to Shiraz, which they will, and they will fulfill this act of pilgrimage. And let's see. Yeah, and then he's reiterating that women don't have to go on pilgrimage, and saying that and this is not a very popular notion right now in our culture, of really seeing motherhood as being of such significance. But it's certainly found there in the Babi faith, and it's also found in the Baha'i faith. And when Baha'u'llah says, he calls upon the monks and nuns to leave their places of refuge, their places of sacred life. He doesn't tell them you should leave those places so that you can, live the fast life and see the benefits of freedom. He says, leave those places so that you can get married and have children that worship God. Okay, just so we're clear about this, that actually the ministry that used to be carried out by Buddhist, Hindu, Sufi, and Christian monks and nuns, where their principal way of worshiping and serving God was to separate themselves from the normal life of human beings and live separately, and not engage in child rearing. Baha'u'llah is making child rearing for everybody. This is one of the most important things we can do in life, is to not just raise children, but teach them about God, have them become believers. This is how you establish a civilization that is God intoxicated. Otherwise, you're just leaving it to chance. There's no continuity from generation to generation. There's no building. It's like every generation will have to have brand new Baha'is, because the Baha'is that existed didn't have kids, or they didn't bring them up Baha'i. And so there's no continuity from generation to generation. Clearly, that is not the intention. Clearly, we're meant to build a foundation that is solid and that will last us for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I think that one of the really beautiful teachings here, as he's ordained that parents are to show love to their children and children to their parents and to each other, because they were all created, nourished, and given life by God through his manifestation. Now, you can look in lots of scriptures and not find that principle that is talking about the importance of love, of human love, between the constituent members of the family. Very significant there. And of course, we do find it in some of the prayers of Abdul Baha, where he's talking about marriage. And when he speaks of marriage in his prayers, it's all about love. It's all about love. It's all about the power of love in a Baha'i marriage to generate not only children who are full of the love of God and humanity, but they also become an attraction for other people to learn about the faith and to become Baha'is. So clearly the family and the home is meant to be like this meta magnet for spiritual development. And friends, I think it's very pertinent that we read this verse when we see the emphasis of the House of Justice right now on people doing this at home. Do this at home. Don't think you have to go to the Baha'i Center. You don't have to travel, teach. You don't have to go somewhere else to live your spiritual life. You can live it at home. You can pray together. You can invite your friends in to your space, and share that love. Now, I hear a strange sound, as if there's a cosmic force trying to tell me to shut up. It's going wah, wah. Does anybody know what I'm talking about?
No, you're just hearing the background noise from Lucinda's audio, I believe.
Oh,
That's why it's important to just stay muted unless you have a question.
okay.
I
So
have a question.
yes. Okay, go.
Sorry. It's a silly question, but in this particular Vahid, it says women are required to give 4 mithqals of gold once in a lifetime as a part of the pilgrimage, and I just don't understand that.
Well, I don't either. No, seriously, I don't understand what that's all about. There, maybe there's some reference someplace else where it says that men are required to give a certain number of miscalls during their pilgrimage. I don't know. We can go looking for it. I can look for it. I think I would observe that a lot of these things have with numbers have a symbolism, and the symbolism is very important for us to contemplate. Whether it's 14 miscalls doesn't really mean much to us. What we don't even know what a miscall is. It's a particular unit that was used for commercial transactions. But you have to look at this in context of various other things where he talks that if somebody is called upon to give a certain amount of money, for example, a dowry when you get married, you have to give a dowry of a certain number of mithqals of gold. And he says, if you can't give it of gold, then give it of silver. And if you can't give it of silver, then there's some kind of arrangement that is made. But it's not an absolute obligation, but it is a recommended gesture of commitment. It's a recommended gift. And I think it's very interesting here where it's the first time that I've seen where he actually talks about that somebody might make pilgrimage many times. And that if they do make it many times, this obligation is only for the lifetime. It's not for every time. And maybe that's the major point here is, you have an obligation to give something for the upkeep of the shrines. But that obligation is not to be every single time, so it doesn't have to be a financial burden on you.
I have one other question. Or not a question, just to connecting the dots on the circles of women. In the indigenous culture, that's a very more of a common application than it is in many other cultures. And I just wanted to, it sounds like a very normal thing for a group of women to do a ceremony in this way. Very powerful ceremony in this way.
This is a very old tradition in many religions. And of course, now it's survived in indigenous culture and it doesn't survive in our culture. It's being revived by, like third wave feminists or something like that, and bless them for that. It's great. But that whole thing of the circle has been part of a distinctive women's culture for a long time, and when I talk about significant decisions and significant experiences in life, very often my sisters, my mother, the women that I know will talk about how important it is to have the circle of women that they are connected with involved in that. They're not doing it alone. They're doing it with this group. And interestingly enough, the symbol that is chosen by the Bab for women to honor spirituality is the daira, which means the circle. In the case of the man, it's the pentacle. It's the pentacle. It's the 5-pointed star, which is the symbol of the human body, right? like this. And there are many connotations to that, and the Bab explains that in various verses, both in Persian Bayan and elsewhere. You know, that the number of Adam is 15. Why is that significant? Because the pentagram is 15. Heikal is what it's called. Heikal has the number 15, and Daira has the number, I've forgotten what the number it has. I'll look it up. But in any case, that number is the number that is associated with women. So let's go to, let's look down. Okay, so now we're in 5. How many people read, did you read, how many people read some of 5? Some of Vahid 5 for today.
Um,
Do
I,
I have,
I think the
Understand?
majority, yeah, I think the majority, if anything was read, it was just the continuation of 4.
okay, that's fine. So we're gonna, Lucinda is raising a hand. So she wants to say something.
I read 5.
You read all of 5?
Well, let me look here how far I got. Yes,
All of 5.
I have time. My son just graduated high school, so, and he moved out. It has his own place, and so my time has changed lately. So this has been like heaven. It's wonderful.
Exactly. Wonderful. All right. So I think there's still some value, even for those who have not read 15, to forge ahead into 15. We won't try to cover the whole thing. How much time do we have, Jeremiah?
Only until 9. So if
What
you
time is it?
start Vahid 5,
What time is it now?
it's 8:12, so you have about
Okay,
45 minutes.
minutes. Oh, great. So we'll make it probably maybe as much as halfway through Vahid 5, and then we can pick up from there. And that will be a good, for those who haven't read Vahid 5, it will be, they will have something to recognize when they pick up the text, because we will have already discussed it here. So in Bab 1, Vahid 5, he reiterates the purpose of the house of God, which is the house of God. Let's make this clear. It's a very broad concept in the Bab's writings. It refers to the place, the place of pilgrimage for the birth and death of the manifestation. In this case, it would be the Bab, the house of the Bab. It also refers to the death would be presumably Tabriz. It also refers to the sacred place associated with each of the letters of the living. It also refers to the masjid. The masjid is the original Arabic for mosque. So it's the place where people come and worship together. So whatever we call this house of God, whatever its particular identity, it is a symbol. It's always a symbol of the manifestation of God, because when he is present upon the earth, he is the sole location of prayer. He's the Qibla. He is the person to whom all prayers are directed. He's our intermediary to God. And there's more, but interestingly, there's more about the house of God in the Babi revelation. There's more about it in the Bab's writings than there was in the Quran. And there's more in the Baha'i writings than there is in the Persian Bayan. So there's a progressive revelation on this particular topic that's really significant. And some of these teachings here will be quite different from the Baha'i teachings. For example, there's no house of worship described like the Mashriq al-Askar. That doesn't exist in the Bab's writings, not to my knowledge, certainly not in the Persian Bayan. But nevertheless, there is an explanation of for example, he says lights. It's very important that there be lots of lights in this place of pilgrimage. And he says that the design and the purpose of these places of worship is to be according to the teachings of the manifestation and not our own ideas. I think that the rest of what is said right here has already been reiterated, so we don't need to oh, and I think this is important. At the end of Bab 2, Vahid 5, he says pilgrimage to the house of God has always existed in the past, and it will always exist in the future. And therefore also at the time of him whom God shall make manifest. This is part of the eternal faith of God. It's an essential teaching of the religion of God. Pilgrimage is something that we need. We'll always need. And now we go to Vahid 5, number 3, where he talks about the calendar. And as I'm sure all of you are aware of, many of the characteristics of the Babi calendar are found in the Persian Bayan and other writings of the Bab. The Baha'i calendar is the Babi calendar with one innovation. Well, maybe a few innovations. I don't want to be pinned down on that because there are a few things that may have been changed as well. But the principal one is the placement of Ayami-ha. And the placement of Ayami-ha before the month of fasting. The Bab does not speak about Ayami-ha. He says that his calendar is a solar calendar and that it must always begin on the first day of the vernal equinox. It must always begin at that point in time. So what gives? There's always going to be some extra days there because the Babi calendar is 361 days in length. And the actual calendar for the world is 365.
Peter, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Specifically, was the reason that the Bab made his a solar calendar just to make sure, because the Islam was stuck or they prescribed to the lunar calendar? Was it to make a demarcation point?
Well, the calendar, the Hijri calendar, is based loosely upon some provisions in the Quran. Most of it came from the Hadith and was developed by scholars in Islam. And there are differences between the Shiite Islamic calendar and the Islamic calendar used by the Sunnis. So in a sense, there's not a standardized calendar in the same way that, for example, the Gregorian calendar was standardized in Western Christianity. It's because it comes from Pope Gregory, okay? Gregory said, this is the way the calendar is going to be. And the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, did not agree with that change, and their calendar is different. they follow the Julian calendar, which was based upon an Emperor Julian who preceded Pope Gregory. But in any case, you're speaking to motivation, and we don't know the motivation of the manifestation of God. That's why Baha'u'llah keeps reiterating, he doeth whatsoever he willeth. He is independent of our understanding and our preferences. But I would point out that the Baha'i calendar is perfection. It is so far superior to any other calendar that's existed. It is perfectly suited to a united humanity, to bring together all of the religions and all the cultures and peoples. Consider this, numerologically, it means something. It means something. 19 months of 19 days. Both of those is 1 times 1. Again, the unity of God, the unity of manifestation, the unity of religion, the unity of mankind. Our very calendar is telling us that. Our very calendar is reminding us of this reality. And what does this calendar begin with? It begins with Nowruz. Nowruz is, we know it's the vernal equinox. What most people don't know is that this has been the beginning of the year for many cultures. It was the original beginning of the year for the Israelites. When they went to Babylonia, they adopted the Babylonian calendar. But prior to that, the month of Adib was the first month of the year, and that corresponds with Nowruz. And of course, we know about Iran, but let's not exaggerate that, because the fact that this was the traditional Zoroastrian calendar, and perhaps even antedating Zoroastrianism in Iran, is not so important, because the Baha'i faith is not a Persian religion, and the Baha'i faith is not a Persian religion. No, the manifestations appeared in Iran, but that doesn't make them Persian. No. It's very important that we understand that they are speaking to all of humanity. And for humanity, we needed a calendar which was going to unite all of us. And so when we unite by beginning the year with the first day of spring, there's just nothing that makes more sense than that. The Bab says in the Persian Bayan, he says that Nowruz, the vernal equinox, is the day in which God created the world. What? He says that the manifestation of God is revealed in this month of Baha. And how interesting it is that we have immediately preceding the month of Baha is the month of Allah. And the Bab himself called himself Nukti Allah, the highest point. And it comes just before the most glorious point. Again, he's preparing for him whom God shall make manifest. This is clearly a calendar that was intended to be Baha'u'llah's calendar and not just the Bab's calendar. And so it should be no surprise at all that this was carried over by Baha'u'llah into the Kitab-i Aqdas. And the other thing, the brilliance of preceding the Ayami-ha, the gift-giving time, precedes the month of fasting, which comes to an end with the beginning of the new year. You see, can you imagine if he put Ayami-ha after the month of Allah? So you fast, and then you have 4 days to party, and then you have the beginning of the new year. What's the point? That's really, no. The beginning of the new year needs to follow a time where you've had deep introspection, when you've done spiritual processing so that you're ready to start something new. This is the truth behind Passover. Passover is, this period of time where you have to go through all this purification, And after Passover comes Shavuot, Pentecost, which is the new beginning. So it's there are a lot of parallels here between calendars. By the way, I just want to mention this. There's a Baha'i who has written a book on the Baha'i calendar and compared it to a number of other calendars. It's really it's a very fine book. And you know, I would, if you're interested in this calendar, I would recommend highly that you look for that book. Just, you know, the publishing trust will come out with it, a new edition very soon. It's been revised. So just if you do a search under calendar on any publishing trust, you'll find it. All right, so we'll go back to the calendar. The Bob talks a lot about the symbolism of the meanings of the different collections of months in the calendar. And this is also no doubt something that Baha'is will be very interested in contemplating in the future to understand, well, what does this mean, and how does this relate to how we live our lives? You know, because Baha'u'llah says about the fast, he says every day of the fast, every moment of the fast is endowed with a unique capacity for our transformation. And if this is so true of the month of fasting, what we find in the writings of the Bab here is that there are special attributes that are associated with other months. And eventually we will do well to pay attention to those as well, and not think we have to wait until the month of fasting in order for something to be special. Can you advance? Let's look at 3. Some of these points we've seen before. Oh, well, here's it. So, all right, one of the allusions to the name of him whom God shall make manifest is to start your calendar with Baha, with the month of Baha, okay? All right, another thing is that he actually says that the first month of the calendar is fixed for, it is intended for him whom God shall make manifest. You see, you're probably saying to yourself at this point, why didn't they all recognize him immediately? Right. Well, you know, this is the perennial problem in religion. We get so far and then we get stuck. And we can only pray that people get unstuck. But we can't make them recognize something. Recognition comes from inside of you. Let's see. Okay, we can go to 4. The 4 talks about recognizing that he encourages Babis to name their children according to the names and attributes of God, and also according to the names of the holy ones of Islam. And let's pay attention to what he says. Why? What's the purpose of this? It's the purpose of everything we do. Everything we do when we're Babis is to be pleasing to him whom God shall make manifest. And here he spells it right out. That's the purpose of having these names, because they are pleasing to the new manifestation of God. Then we come to this is an interesting thing. If you look at 15, so much of the time the Bab is talking about our obligations, the nature of the manifestation, the importance of the Word of God. And we tend to think of these things, they're out of us. They're outside of our control. They're greater than us. But he brings it home here. He brings it home in this, in Bab 4 of Vahid 5, by saying that everything that pertains to religion is for us. It's for us. God doesn't need religion. We need religion. God doesn't need for his spirit and his truth to be affirmed by his creation. We need it. It is for our benefit. And consequently, this whole idea of paradise pertains to us, has to do with us attaining the good pleasure of God and attaining joy and happiness and eternal fulfillment. I think that this is something that we find in the Baha'i writings, but we don't contemplate it enough. We tend to think, because of many aspects of our lives, that this is outside of us, that revelation is outside of us, religion is outside of us, and it tells us what we need to do. We don't recognize that it's a reflection of it is responding to our needs. This is like food. When your parents give you food, when your beloved companion and partner gives you food, it's not because it benefits them. It's because it benefits you. It nourishes you. And this is the whole purpose of this, is nourishing what is already in the human being. We have a spiritual nature, and that spiritual nature cannot grow and cannot predominate in its influence in our lives unless it's nourished. And this nourishment is always available, but we have to discover it. And we have to, and that's why it's so important, again, this whole thing of parenthood. Because without parents who will introduce us to this spiritual dimension of life and of spiritual nourishment, how are we supposed to get it? Who's it supposed to come from? Why would we trust it to come from any other source? The parents have assumed full responsibility for us from the time we're born. You cannot think of a more perfect spiritual educator for the human being than their parents. These are all things that we're going to recognize. The true knowledge is the knowledge of God, and this is not but the knowledge of his manifestation in each manifestation, which in the French would have been dispensation. And wealth is not wealth as we know it in this world. It's poverty in relationship to God. It's poverty in relationship to the manifestations. So now we'll go to 5. How are we doing for time?
We're good. It's 8:33, so you have another, I'd say, 20 minutes.
Okay, why don't we do this? Rather than forging ahead, why don't we pause here, perhaps for a moment, but perhaps also for today, and invite people to make their comments, to ask their questions, to have a chance to listen to somebody else besides me.
Okay, so does anyone here have any questions about anything that was discussed? The only comment I have to make, honestly, is it's only a couple of years ago I came across the whole concept of the kingship in the faith. Prior to that, I had a very democratic understanding of it. So that was interesting. And it's like the second time that I've really thought about it in the past 3 or 4 years. Kirk, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks.
Welcome back.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Peter. On a couple of occasions today and other occasions before, there have been questions or issues raised about the laws that are laid down in the Bayan. And it was my understanding that they've been superseded by Baha'u'llah. That therefore they are historical in some sense. Was that a fair assessment? It's been more than once that has been enunciated to me. Would you agree with that, or how would you how do you find that state of affairs?
So the Bab gives us the principle that the new manifestation of God has complete authority to completely alter the laws and the teachings of his dispensation. Now, first of all, we really have to put that in context, because the manifestation himself says he has no control over it at all. It all comes from God. So it's not like Baha'u'llah can do whatever he wants. No, it means that God can do whatever he wants through Baha'u'llah. That's really what it means. And that means, and in the previous chapter, the Bab explained this teaching, and he said the only bid'ah, which is the act of God changing his mind, happens with a dispensation. It happens when there's a new manifestation of God revealing a new book. That's God changing his mind, so to speak, because we need something else for that particular age. But the concept that theologians loved, if they could point to an instance where God changed his mind within one dispensation, or from one time to another time during his own life of the manifestation, then they could muscle in and say, well, you see, if he can change his mind, if God can change his mind, then that means that the book is not a standard of truth for humanity. Because, it can be, it's mutable, okay? And so here again, let's understand this in the big picture. Baha'u'llah could have revealed a completely new set of laws that had nothing to do with the Persian Bayan or anything else revealed by Baha'u'llah. He could have. The Bab makes it clear, if you are a follower of mine and you do not follow what him whom God shall make manifest reveals, you are no longer a Babi. You are no longer acceptable before God, because you have disobeyed the most important principle, which is to follow his messenger when he reveals himself. So what do we have? What is the fact? The fact is that if you study the Kitab-i Aqdas and you study the other legal teachings of Baha'u'llah, most of the laws come from the Persian Bayan. Most of them are almost exact iterations of the Persian Bayan. When he makes a change, he references the Persian Bayan. For example, he says, well, you can have 2 wives, but only if you can treat the 2 of wives with justice. That's what the Kitab al-Aqdas says. In the Persian Bayan, it said you can have 2 wives if your first wife doesn't have any children. That's the principle there in the Persian Bayan. So that it's possible for you to have children, but then you don't divorce the first wife. Why would you divorce? It's not that wife's fault. We won't get into the fact that it probably was the man who was infertile rather than the woman. But in any case, and because of the nature of the Babi laws, it could be interpreted in a number of ways. But Baha'u'llah says that bigamy is possible, but it has to be done with justice. And then Abdul Baha says, but you can't do it with justice. It's not possible to treat 2 spouses exactly the same. So monogamy is intended. And, you know, some people would look at this and they say, well, what's going on here? Why don't you just spell it out? Well, we're dealing with human beings and their consciousness, their change of consciousness. Before the Babi faith, there was no ruling in any religion that prevented people from having multiple spouses. There's nothing in Christianity that blocks people from having multiple spouses. Of course, there are some theologians who have interpreted it that way, but the reality is that polygamy is not disallowed by Christianity. It's certainly not clearly disallowed by Islam either. Then you have the Bab saying, it's preferable that you have 1 wife, but if the first one is infertile, then you can have a second one. That's really conditional, my friends. You can't have a second wife just because you feel like it. You know, you can only have 1 if you want to have kids and your first wife can't have kids. That's the principle. And then Baha'u'llah says, you can have 2, but only if you could treat both of them with justice, which is, and then you have Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi saying, but this is monogamy. This is shepherding human consciousness from the belief that a man can have as many women as he wants to a belief that a man can only have 1 woman and then he better treat her properly because otherwise he won't have any at all. This is a big consciousness change. And, you know, clearly it's a consciousness change that humanity is very much struggling with still at our time, because there's so many people who can't get it right. And that may continue for hundreds of years to come.
Thousands. But it's a good example. It is a good example of what you're saying because of the point, the larger issue of that the supersession has occurred, because the rationale, I'm sorry, of the Bab is not continued by Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah adopts a different rationale. So it's an example of the Bab being effectively now historical rather than being in force. Wouldn't you say?
None of his laws are enforced. As soon as the Kitab al-Aqdas comes into existence and is promulgated by Baha'u'llah, there's not a single law of the Persian Bayan that holds up anymore. Not a single one.
That's
not a single one.
That's what I've heard before. So yeah. that's consistent.
But I would say this: there are teachings in the Persian Bayan which, at some point, Baha'is may feel are compatible with their values, and that they want to implement them. For example, I brought up this whole thing of pilgrimage to Shiraz, of women, of creating a circle and praying together in Shiraz, a group of women. It's possible that a group of Baha'i women at some point in the future, when it's possible to make pilgrimage to Shiraz, which may not happen for a very long time, but when it is, it's possible that a group of women will do that either with a consciousness of the Persian Bayan or without. And that then we know where that goes. That goes to the House of Justice. because we don't derive authority for Baha'i praxis, Baha'i behavior from the Persian Bayan. We derive our authority from Baha'i scripture and from the universals of justice. And otherwise, it'd be kind of a strange state of affairs if you had Baha'is who were dipping into previous revelations saying, well, I like this one, so I'm gonna follow that one. I like the idea of having tattoos on our chests, so that
it would make for challenging consultations. Let's just put it that way. But, one more thing, Peter, separate from that. Some weeks ago, I brought up some particular passages from one of the Wahids, earlier Wahids, that you said you would take to the translator group of BahaiLibrary.com. I'm wondering if they ever got back to you, if that anything came of that.
No, and I'll tell you, it all has to do with my ineptitude when it comes to using technical, anything that postdates the electric typewriter. Okay, right? Pretty much that's where I stand. Okay. And so when people tell me, oh, there's this new software, I close my ears. It's like, I don't want to know about this.
But it's an ever progressive civilization, Peter. Be careful what you close your ears to.
But I'm not interested in an ever progressing technology.
So what does that have to do with the translations? You said there's something about
they went into the chat box and they didn't get to me. So if you will email me the specific verses that you are interested in, then I will pass them along. And
let's start over.
Yes, let's start over, and then. But I like email. Email is the last thing I'm going to do. Okay?
That's what you need. All right.
I'm not doing Instagram. I'm not doing Telegram. Nope. All power to you if you do it. But I'm one of those people who doesn't want to be preoccupied with the medium. You remember there was this fellow named Marshall McLuhan who talked about the medium is the message. I don't agree. To me, the message is the most important.
You've just alienated every Canadian on the channel right now.
Yeah, right. How the message gets out depends on the circumstances for the messengers. Who can use what means to pass along the message. But to me, the message is always first and foremost. And also, just on a note of humor here, the Bob said that we should preserve and promote his scriptures in the most beautiful of handwriting, in the most beautiful of bound books. We are supposed to take care of our scriptures with more love and devotion than any previous religion has ever done. Because in previous religions, it's the copy that's in the synagogue that's beautiful. It's the copy that's in the cathedral that's beautiful. But the copy you have at home, no, it's all dog-eared, it's a mess. Well, not so. The Bob wants every copy that we own, and the best copy should be the one that we have at home. And we shouldn't give away the best copy unless we have another version that is of equal value. Then we can give that one away. So this principle of perfection in transmission is something that I haven't yet seen in the digital world. So, well, and I don't expect.
I will add one thing to that, though. One of the great beauties, particularly the script of Arabic and Farsi script, would be that if we could have electronic versions of those that we could actually work with, that would be a great step forward, because those of us who are not conversant in the languages need the assistance of translation devices or websites or whatever. And being able to copy and paste the electronic versions of those scripts into those things would be a, a great advantage. I know this because in those opportunities I've had to have electronic script of the Arabic or the Persian or the Farsi from Nadir Saidi particularly has provided some of those on occasion. And I've been able to work with them using these translation websites, and it's provided the equivalent of an interlinear translation effectively. I've been able to kind of construct my own for small bits, just little bits. And it has been an enormous, for me, a revelatory in the sense of what kind of the inner meaning of these things might be. I'm not saying I have any sense of absolutes here, but in my past lives of being raised Jewish and of being Christian, as choosing Christianity before being a Baha'i, I was able to use formal interlinear translations of the Hebrew scriptures and of the Christian Testament. And it was really revelatory because I'm not versed in either Hebrew or Greek. So it was very, very enlightening to me to be able to work with the text that way. So I would say that would be one of the great steps forward of a digital format that might not be available in a physical format. I couldn't work with it that way because we don't have any former interlinear translations of any of the major works of in the Baha'i writings that I'm aware of.
Okay.
If you know of them, I would love to know about them,
Yes,
but I haven't been able to find any.
Two bits of news. One is a suggestion that came from Alex, and I want to share it with all of you because you're now a second person bringing up this question. I think that there is probably quite a bit of interest, even among members of this group, to have the opportunity to be introduced to the fundamentals of the Persian and Arabic languages. This is not rocket science. It's not terribly difficult. It can be done with a good teacher and great visuals in a way that will open doors for anybody. It doesn't make you a fluent reader. It doesn't make you a scholar, but it gives you an overall understanding of how the scripts work and how the grammatical systems work. And so I'm going to tickle the fancy of the organizers of the Clearwater series to see if we might be able to do that in the relative near future, because it's not an insurmountable obstacle. To really dedicate yourself to become completely fluent in the languages so that you could you can pick up any book of Baha'u'llah and read him in the original language is not something that most people are going to learn how to do. But to have a basic understanding of the language and to be able to look up particular words for yourself using a dictionary and figure out what the meaning is. This is, I had to go to undergraduate and graduate school to learn this. And then I found out years later, I didn't need to go to graduate or undergraduate. I could have gotten this all from a good teacher, and I found a good teacher. I've somebody who taught himself Arabic and Persian, and he's one of the finest translators we have right now in the Baha'i community. And friends, he is 24 years old.
What's his name?
His name is Joshua Hall. His name is Joshua Hall, and he's a very close friend of Adib Masumian. And Adib Masumian is also in his 20s and brilliant translator. And that's where I come to parallel texts. Go to Adib Masumian's website and you will see parallel texts of the original on one side and his translation on the other side.
Yeah, you can also find Joshua gave a presentation on our website. So if you search in the search box, you should be able to pull it up, Joshua Hall. John's been waiting, so I want to get to John and let him ask his question, and then we need to close out after that.
Well, mine is just a comment on the Bob and Baha'u'llah that I've read several scholars who thought that the first, this revelation of Baha'u'llah, the first manifestation, was going to be martyred. So and aren't we using the Bob's calendar and the ringstones, the Bobs, I believe? But they've also mentioned that these things we're not using from the Bob, being this was so traumatic, and with loss of Fort Tabarsi and the persecution so extreme, that the Bob was writing things for this particular time and this particular audience that the Bob didn't mean for it to go on and on. He had to use some strong, stringent writings with lots of prayers. I remember reciting lots of prayers and things that, so these scholars are saying that the Bob knew parts of what he was writing were for that tumultuous moment and leaving it up for Baha'u'llah. So it's not that we're not using it, it's that it wasn't meant to be used that way. So I can't remember the scholars' names and the books I've read this in, but anyway, I've read this from several Baha'is who have the older ones who have their books out. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just would say that John, that seems to be very much in agreement with what the Bob is saying himself, because what he's saying over and over is whatever I write, whatever I reveal, will be either reiterated by him whom God shall make manifest, or it will not. It's completely in his hands. And so and the other point I would make is that this idea that it was revolutionary and it shocked people and that it brought about rapid change of consciousness is fully reflected in the history of the time. When we look at the lives of the Babi's and we look at the behavior there, a guy went from being a regular guy who's got a church job to being, out on the front lines with his fellow believers, facing certain death. That takes a tremendous change of consciousness. And it's not incremental. It's not evolutionary. It happened really fast, and so, of course, that's not sustainable. Baha'u'llah's revelation is meant to overshadow the manifestations that will appear for the next 500,000 years. It is not only sustainable, it is sustainable beyond anything we've ever experienced as human beings. We've never had a manifestation who is going to have that reach, that kind of influence over a period of time. And yes, but we must remember that the Bab is always going to be part of our religion. He's not relegated to the past at all. When in the will and testament of Abdul Baha, when he talks about the guidance for the Universal House of Justice and the Guardian, he says it's coming from Baha'u'llah and the Bab. And this is unprecedented also, to have two supreme manifestations of God guiding us together. Talk about horsepower. It's really, and it's an extraordinary experience that we have. And if we only understand a very small part of it, we shouldn't beat up on ourselves, because humanity is going to have a long time to learn how this works. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. and best wishes for the coming week. I hope that we can get through 5 next time, and that you'll all have a chance to read 5, and then we'll turn the next week to the next 6, maybe 6 and 7. We'll see how long. I don't remember exactly how long they are. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Bye, everyone.